Anthony Albanese is set to become the first Australian Prime Minister to visit China in 7 years. The Prime Minister has accepted the invitation to visit Beijing in a bid to strengthen trade ties. This happened while meeting with the Chinese Premier on the sidelines of the East Asia Summit in Jakarta. Joining me now is Shadow Foreign Affairs Minister Simon Birmingham. Simon, great to see you. This is pretty unequivocally good news, isn't it?
Good morning, LJ. Well, we still have a number of very serious issues between China and Australia, particularly serious ones where China continues to apply coercive trade sanctions against Australia and to unfairly detain Australian citizens, as well as a number of other concerns. And so Prime Minister Albanese must be very confident that his visit is going to yield meaningful progress in seeing more of these trade sanctions lifted and progress in terms of fairer treatment of those detained Australians. And that's what his visit will be judged against. He needs to ensure very carefully that the visit he undertakes to China is not one that can be used for propaganda purposes and isn't overly done with symbolism, but is a practical, working visit to get real and meaningful outcomes for Australian exporters and for detained Australians.
What should we make of the timing?
Well, the government has been working through this process since Beijing made its decision to cease its refusal to meet with Australian ministers, and it's welcome that China reversed that refusal to meet with Australian ministers, and we have given every bit of bipartisan support towards the government in terms of engaging with China. It is sensible that we engage to try to ensure the peace and stability of our region and try to maximise the benefits out of our economic relationship and other spheres of cooperation. But all of that needs to be done in a lens where we are also honest and upfront about the problems that continue to exist as a result of China's actions against Australia, as well as other concerns about China's increased militarisation within the region, continued human rights abuses, continued concerns in relation to China's crackdown in Hong Kong, and the consequential impacts that's having, for example, on Hong Kongers who are in Australia, and concerns about allegations of the targeting of them or their families, all of which should be raised very directly by the Prime Minister.
So you think these issues should be raised directly? Raising those issues in the past about China's human rights hasn't damaged our trade at all?
We have been able in the past to be very open and frank about our concerns in matters such as Tibet or Xinjiang and the treatment of Uyghurs, whilst also, for example, sealing the free trade agreement that was negotiated by the coalition with China and growing our trade to record volumes. And so we can and must make sure that we're true to all of our values, and our values are as a free and open trading nation and market economy, but as also as a nation that stands up for international human rights and what we believe in terms of the treatment of people, and particularly concerns about forced labour. Just last week we saw the 12-month anniversary of the UN Special Rapporteur's report in relation to the treatment of Uyghur people in Xinjiang region. It is concerning that the government has taken no significant action on that report. Other like-minded countries have placed targeted sanctions, used their Magnitsky-style sanctions or the like to respond in terms of concerns about the Chinese government's treatment of the Uyghur people, forced labour schemes, re-education type schemes, very disturbing things that are identified in that UN report. And so we should be clear, and the government shouldn't be afraid of taking action, and it will enjoy bipartisan support for any such action.
Should we be a little circumspect about expectations from this meeting? This is a really great first step. Those face-to-face meetings are super important, but should we expect, all trade tariffs to lift that very next day, or do you accept that there might be a little time in between the meeting and other actions that might follow?
LJ, we should expect meaningful outcomes from Prime Minister Albanese's visit. There have been numerous meetings between the Prime Minister himself and senior Chinese leadership, including President Xi. There have been multiple meetings between foreign ministers, trade ministers and other senior ministers. So we've seen a welcome, as I say, resumption of that dialogue by Beijing, and that is a positive. and it's seen some progress, which we welcome. But a prime ministerial visit to another country is a very significant step to be taken, and that's why I say the Prime Minister needs to make sure that it is not just about the symbolism of the visit, not able to be used unduly for propaganda or other type purposes, but is a practical working visit, and he needs to have assured himself prior to accepting this invitation that real and meaningful progress is going to be made in addressing and removing those trade sanctions and getting fairer treatment for those detained Australians.
Okay, let me just ask you about Qatar, because it's hard to know where we're even up to here. Catherine King saying what happened to those
well, the government doesn't, that's for sure.
Yeah, the 5 Australian women was context but not a factor in decision making, but maintains that this decision was made in the national interest. Do we just accept that now?
No. We have a Senate inquiry to rightly dig into this. There are still questions to be answered about how the government was influenced, whether the Prime Minister's office had a role and what lobbying took place through that sphere, what other consultations took place across government and what other lobbying or influence was peddled across government or over the government. We need to understand actually what the grounds were. It's one thing for the government to keep repeating the words national interest, but there have to be national interest grounds for why you determine that rejecting this is not in the national interest. You've got the ridiculous proposition where Richard Marles just this morning has said we need greater competition in Australia's aviation market. Well, you don't get greater competition by saying no to a competitor having extra landing slots in Australia. That makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. So you've got the government at complete odds with one another. The Prime Minister says endlessly we've got the most competitive aviation market in the world. The Deputy Prime Minister says we need more competition in the aviation market. The Transport Minister says the treatment a number of years ago, and it was appalling treatment, I know, of a number of women through Doha Airport was a factor in the decision. Yet elsewhere, the government says they'd like to see Qatar put on more flights in secondary airports like Adelaide or bigger planes.
Should it have been a factor?
Well, we should note a couple of factors there. One is that it's not Qatar Airways that were responsible for that decision. They were actions of security at the airport. The Qatari government has subsequently addressed and apologised in relation to that, as they should. They were reprehensible acts. Well, the Australian government at the time, previous coalition government, Foreign Minister Payne at the time, made very strong representations to Qatar, as was correct.
But
Qatar
didn't you delay a decision on Qatar, this very issue, for 4 years?
There were delays undertaken while the review occurred, but ultimately a decision was also made to provide for additional access into Australia. And it was made in the interests of consumers and competition. And that's what is at the heart of this in the end.
Yeah.
Australians are paying more for airfares. Tourists are finding it harder to get to Australia, which hurts our tourism industry and jobs. Exporters will find there's less space in the bellies of aircraft to get product out of Australia. This is a lose-lose-lose situation in terms of the government's decision, and they can't explain the decision. And sometimes when you have made a decision that clearly is so wrong, it's just better for government to acknowledge they made a mistake, to review it, reconsider it and change it. And that's really what this government should be thinking. It should be acting on the Federal Labor President Wayne Swan's advice, Labor Premiers of South Australia, of Western Australia, the Acting Premier in Queensland, all of whom have said it's a bad decision. Go back to the drawing board and start again is what the Albanese government should be doing on Qatar Airways.
No sign of that happening just yet. Simon Birmingham, appreciate your time.